The French Revolution did not emerge from a singular moment or event, but rather from a long history of social, economic, and political issues that had been festering for years. By the time the revolution erupted in 1789, France had been struggling with severe financial crises, rampant inequality, and a sense of disillusionment with the monarchy and the feudal system. The vast gap between the wealth and privilege enjoyed by the aristocracy and the harsh realities faced by the common people created a volatile atmosphere, ready for change. At the heart of the unrest was the ancient social order, the Ancien Regime, which divided French society into three distinct estates. The first estate was made up of the clergy, the second estate consisted of the nobility, and the third estate represented the common people, or bourgeoisie, which included peasants, workers, and the emerging middle class. This rigid class structure placed immense power and privilege in the hands of the first and second estates, while the third estate, despite making up 98% of the population, had little political influence and bore the burden of taxation. The clergy and nobility were largely exempt from taxes, while the common people were heavily taxed to finance the royal court and the lavish lifestyle of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. Economically, France was in dire straits. The country's involvement in costly wars, including the American Revolution, had drained its treasury. The lavish spending of the royal family only exacerbated the financial crisis. France was also suffering from a series of poor harvests in the late 1780s, which led to widespread famine. Grain shortages meant bread, the staple food for the majority of the population, became scarce and extremely expensive. Starving peasants and urban workers were forced to pay exorbitant prices for food, while the aristocracy continued to live in luxury, further deepening the divide between the classes. The Enlightenment played a crucial role in shaping the ideas and desires of the revolution. Thinkers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire critiqued the oppressive nature of monarchies and the inequality inherent in the social system. Their works questioned the divine right of kings, promoted the concept of natural rights, and argued for a government that was accountable to the people rather than one that was absolute and untouchable. These ideas found a receptive audience among the educated bourgeoisie and, to some extent, the peasantry. The people were no longer willing to accept their suffering as their lot in life, and the philosophical foundations for revolution began to take root. As the financial crisis worsened, King Louis XVI, desperate to resolve the country's debt, called for the Estates General in 1789, an assembly of representatives from all three estates for the first time since 1614. The Estates General was supposed to address the economic issues facing France, but it quickly became clear that the power dynamics within the assembly were skewed in favor of the clergy and nobility. Each estate was granted one vote, meaning that the first and second estates, which represented a small fraction of the population, could outvote the third estate, which represented the vast majority of the people. This system of voting frustrated the representatives of the third estate, who felt that they were being denied a fair voice in matters of national importance. In May 1789, the Third Estate, sensing that their concerns were being ignored, declared itself the National Assembly, claiming to represent the people of France. The members of the National Assembly pledged to draft a new constitution that would limit the powers of the king and ensure more equality and fairness in governance. This act of defiance signaled the beginning of a revolutionary movement that would not be easily quelled. In response to the National Assembly's actions, King Louis XVI attempted to suppress the rising unrest by calling in the military to maintain order. However, the people of Paris were growing increasingly agitated, particularly as the economic conditions worsened. By July 1789, the situation had become explosive. The urban poor, facing hunger and frustration, stormed the Bastille, a symbol of royal tyranny and oppression, on July 14th. The fall of the Bastille marked a significant turning point in the revolution. Although the Bastille was a relatively small fortress with few prisoners, its capture was a powerful symbol of the people's resistance against the monarchy and the old order. It signified the breaking of the traditional power structure, where the king and his representatives had once held absolute control. The storming of the Bastille was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader wave of uprisings and revolts that swept through Paris and the provinces. The Great Fear, a period of panic and unrest in the countryside, saw peasants attacking aristocratic estates and destroying documents that bound them to feudal obligations. The National Assembly, now the de facto government of France, began implementing sweeping reforms. They abolished feudal privileges and sought to address the social and economic inequalities that had led to the revolution in the first place. At the same time, the National Assembly worked to create a new political order. In August 1789, the Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a revolutionary document that outlined the basic principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The Declaration was inspired by Enlightenment ideals and emphasized the importance of individual rights, national sovereignty, and the need for a fair and just government. It was a direct challenge to the traditional powers of the monarchy and the aristocracy, proclaiming that all men were born free and equal in rights. However, the revolution was far from over. The fall of the Bastille and the Declaration of the Rights of Man were only the beginning. As the revolution progressed, the National Assembly would face intense internal and external challenges, with radical factions demanding more radical change and external threats from other monarchies eager to crush the revolution. The revolution would evolve into a struggle not only for political and social change, but for survival itself, leading to the rise of more extreme measures and, ultimately, the Reign of Terror. The seeds of the French Revolution had been planted long before 1789, and the years of inequality, economic hardship, and intellectual ferment made the revolution inevitable. The fall of the Bastille marked the first step in a long and turbulent journey that would forever change the course of history. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, marked the beginning of an irreversible shift in the course of French history. It was not just a violent attack on a royal prison. It was a symbolic act of defiance against the monarchy's tyranny and the old feudal system. The Bastille, once a symbol of royal oppression, had long been a place where political prisoners, often those who opposed the king, were held without trial. To the people of Paris, it represented everything that was wrong with the monarchy: unchecked power, brutality, and injustice. When the storming of the Bastille succeeded, it was not just the physical structure that fell, but the concept of absolute monarchy that had ruled France for centuries. In the immediate aftermath of the Bastille's fall, the revolutionary fervor in Paris reached a fever pitch. The National Assembly, which had already taken a bold stand by declaring itself the legitimate government of France, quickly gained more support from the people. The Assembly, composed largely of members of the Third Estate, now had the momentum to push for further reforms. The monarchy, which had once held an iron grip over the country, was losing its influence at an alarming rate. In the weeks that followed, the National Assembly took swift and decisive actions to dismantle the old social order. On August 4, 1789, in a dramatic session, the Assembly abolished feudal privileges, including the right of the nobility to collect taxes and the peasantry's obligation to pay them. This decision was a direct blow to the aristocracy and made clear that the revolution was not just a protest against the monarchy, but against the entire feudal system that had kept the majority of the population in poverty and subjugation for centuries. The abolition of feudal privileges was a key moment in the revolution, signaling that the people would no longer tolerate being ruled by a small, wealthy elite. At the same time, the National Assembly worked to formalize the rights of citizens. On August 26, 1789, the Assembly passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a revolutionary document that articulated the fundamental principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment, the Declaration boldly proclaimed that all men are born free and equal in rights. It declared that sovereignty belonged to the people, not the monarchy, and emphasized the importance of personal liberty, property rights, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration was not just a theoretical document. It was a statement of intent, a clear signal to both the French people and the world that the old system of governance was no longer valid. Despite these early victories, the National Assembly faced a volatile and unpredictable situation. While the abolition of feudalism and the adoption of the Declaration of the Rights of Man were monumental steps, they did not immediately address the practical issues facing the country. The the economic crisis persisted, with food shortages and high bread prices continuing to plague the population. As the people of Paris were beginning to feel the first real effects of the revolution, the need for tangible, concrete change became more urgent. In October 1789, in a dramatic and highly symbolic act, thousands of women from Paris marched to the Palace of Versailles. The women, who had been suffering from hunger and the soaring price of bread, demanded that the king and queen return to Paris. Their march was not just an expression of anger over food shortages, but also a challenge to the king's authority. At Versailles, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette had been living in isolation, surrounded by luxury, seemingly oblivious to the suffering of the people. The march to Versailles was a powerful reminder that the monarchy could no longer be detached from the realities facing the common people. The king was forced to return to Paris, where he was now essentially a prisoner of the revolution. This event marked a turning point in the relationship between the monarchy and the people. Louis XVI and his family were no longer seen as divine rulers, but as individuals who were increasingly at the mercy of the revolutionaries. Meanwhile, the National Assembly pressed on with its reforms. In 1790, the Assembly passed the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, a law that sought to bring the Catholic Church under state control. The clergy, who had traditionally been aligned with the monarchy and the nobility, were now required to swear an oath of loyalty to the state. This move was highly controversial, especially among devout Catholics, and it created a major rift between the revolutionaries and the Church. Nevertheless, the Civil Constitution of the Clergy was another indication that the National Assembly was determined to reshape every institution in France, from religion to politics, in the image of the new republic. As the revolution progressed, the situation became more complicated. While the National Assembly pushed forward with reform, factions within the revolution began to emerge. On the one hand, the more moderate members of the Assembly, known as the Girondins, sought to create a constitutional monarchy, where the king would retain some powers but would be held in check by a legislative body. On the other hand, the more radical elements, led by figures such as Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobins, called for the complete abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic. Tensions began to rise as the revolutionaries faced resistance from both external and internal enemies. France was not isolated, and many European monarchies feared that the revolution could inspire uprisings in their own countries. In response, France declared war on Austria and Prussia in April 1792, setting the stage for the French Revolutionary Wars. The war only intensified the divisions within France, as the royalists and conservatives sought to preserve the old order, while the revolutionaries sought to expand the gains of the revolution. In the face of these challenges, the monarchy continued to weaken. In June 1791, King Louis XVI and his family attempted to flee Paris in what became known as the Flight to Varennes. The royal family hoped to seek refuge in Varennes and then rally support from foreign monarchies to restore their power. However, their escape was foiled, and they were brought back to Paris in humiliation. The failed attempt to flee shattered any remaining illusions about the king's commitment to the revolution and solidified the growing desire for a republic. The storming of the Bastille had been the spark, but it was the decisions, actions, and symbolic acts that followed that began to truly reshape France. The abolition of feudalism, the declaration of the rights of man, the fall of Versailles, and the growing tensions between moderates and radicals all set the stage for the next phase of the revolution. The old regime had been dismantled, but the path forward was uncertain, fraught with challenges, and marked by increasingly radical changes that would eventually lead to the downfall of the monarchy and the rise of a new, revolutionary order. As the French Revolution progressed, the initial wave of optimism and reform began to give way to a much darker period of instability and violence. The National Assembly had succeeded in overthrowing the monarchy and dismantling the feudal system, but the newly formed government faced a rapidly escalating series of crises, both from within France and from abroad. The country was embroiled in war, facing both external enemies, such as Austria and Prussia, and internal threats from royalists, counter-revolutionaries, and conservative factions who sought to restore the old regime. These pressures pushed the revolution into more radical territory, culminating in the period known as the Reign of Terror. In 1792, the French Revolution entered a more perilous phase as the monarchy was formally abolished and the Republic was declared. This monumental shift was not without complications. The declaration of war against Austria and Prussia, combined with the rising threat of royalist uprisings within France, sent the country into turmoil. Revolutionary France, struggling on multiple fronts, was plunged into an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. The radical faction known as the Jacobins, led by figures such as Maximilien Robespierre, took control of the revolutionary government and began implementing increasingly extreme measures to preserve the revolution and eliminate threats to its survival. The newly established Committee of Public Safety, which Robespierre was a key figure in, became the main body responsible for overseeing the revolution's defense against external and internal enemies. The committee, in the face of mounting threats, called for severe action. This led to the establishment of the Reign of Terror, a period between September 1793 and July 1794 during which thousands of perceived enemies of the revolution were executed by guillotine, many without trial or substantial evidence. The government justified these executions as necessary for the survival of the Republic, claiming that revolutionary ideals could only be secured by rooting out enemies who would destroy them. The Reign of Terror was characterized by an atmosphere of fear and paranoia. Revolutionary tribunals were set up to judge suspected counter-revolutionaries, and the law of suspects was passed, allowing for the arrest and execution of anyone deemed an enemy of the revolution. The revolutionary government, seeking to suppress royalist sympathies, radical moderates, and counter-revolutionary movements, increasingly focused on ideological purity. This created a climate where personal vendettas and accusations could lead to swift and brutal consequences. Anyone from aristocrats to ordinary citizens who were accused of being disloyal to the revolution risked being arrested and executed, often with little evidence to support their guilt. The most famous victim of this period was King Louis XVI himself. In January 1793, after being convicted of treason by the National Convention, Louis was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution in Paris. His execution was a symbolic act representing the complete destruction of the old monarchy and its authoritarian rule. His wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, followed him to the guillotine in October 1793. The execution of the king was a turning point in the revolution, as it eliminated the possibility of reconciliation with the old regime. It also shocked many both inside and outside France, as it made clear that no one, not even the monarch, was safe from the revolution's wrath. Although the Reign of Terror was a time of immense brutality, it was also a period in which significant changes were made to French society. Revolutionary leaders sought to instill the ideals of the revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity into every aspect of life. The cult of the Supreme Being, a new deistic religion created by Robespierre, replaced Catholicism as the state religion. Churches were closed, religious symbols were removed, and the state sought to create a secular society in line with revolutionary principles. The calendar was also reformed, with the year 1792 being declared the first year of the French Republic. Months were renamed, and a 10-day week was introduced to replace the traditional 7-day week, further emphasizing the break from the old world. Despite these sweeping changes, the Reign of Terror took a devastating toll on France. While the government justified the violence as a necessary measure to protect the revolution, it was clear that the power of the state had become increasingly centralized in the hands of the radical Jacobins. The purge of perceived enemies of the revolution created divisions within the revolutionary factions themselves. As the terror wore on, even former allies of Robespierre found themselves in danger. The most prominent of these was Georges Danton, a leading revolutionary figure and one of the key architects of the early stages of the revolution. Danton and his followers were accused of being too moderate and, in 1794, were executed by guillotine as part of Robespierre's purge. By the summer of 1794, the excesses of the Reign of Terror had led to growing opposition within the revolution itself. Many in the National Convention, and even some of Robespierre's allies, began to fear that he had become too powerful and was no longer acting in the interests of the revolution. Robespierre's strict enforcement of revolutionary ideals had alienated many, and his increasing authoritarianism sparked discontent. On July 27, 1794, Robespierre was arrested in a coup known as the Thermidorian reaction. The following day, he was executed, marking the end of the Reign of Terror. His fall from power marked a shift away from the radicalism that had defined the revolution's most violent period. With Robespierre's death, the Reign of Terror came to an end, but the revolution was far from over. The period that followed, known as the Thermidorian reaction, saw a return to more moderate policies. The National Convention attempted to restore order and stabilize the economy, but the damage done during the Terror had left lasting scars on French society. Many of the revolutionary ideals that had sparked the revolution were compromised in the aftermath of the Terror, as the government struggled to balance the demands of progress with the need for stability. The Reign of Terror had irreversibly changed the course of the French Revolution. It had crushed any hopes of a peaceful resolution and turned the revolution into a violent and bloody struggle for ideological dominance. It also left the country in a state of chaos, with political factions at odds and foreign armies continuing to threaten France. While the Reign of Terror was justified by its leaders as a necessary evil to protect the revolution, its legacy was one of division, fear, and bloodshed. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which had sparked the revolution, had been severely tested by the very revolutionaries who had sought to preserve them. As France entered the post-terror period, it would become clear that the revolution was far from reaching its final stages, and that the rise of new, powerful figures would soon reshape the country once again. After the fall of Robespierre and the end of the Reign of Terror, France found itself in a precarious position. The violence of the past few years had left deep scars on the nation, both in terms of human lives lost and the societal divisions that had emerged. While many revolutionaries had hoped for a republic based on the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the reality was much more chaotic and uncertain. The Thermidorian reaction brought about a temporary stabilization, but it was clear that the revolution had taken a toll on France that could not be easily undone. The country was left to navigate the aftermath of the Terror while also dealing with ongoing internal and external challenges. The National Convention, which had governed during the height of the revolution, sought to restore order after the fall of Robespierre. It moved away from the radicalism of the Terror, attempting to reintroduce a sense of moderation and pragmatism into French politics. However, this was easier said than done. Many of the revolutionaries who had risen to power during the early years of the revolution had been radicalized by their experiences, and the violent purges had created an atmosphere of suspicion. Trust between factions had been shattered, and the country's political landscape remained deeply divided. The new government, known as the Directory, was established in 1795, marking the beginning of a more moderate phase of the revolution. The Directory was a 5-member executive body that aimed to balance power between various factions within the revolution. It also sought to stabilize the economy and consolidate the gains of the revolution while maintaining a republic. However, the Directory was deeply flawed. It struggled with corruption, inefficiency, and political instability. Many of its leaders were out of touch with the needs of the common people, and their attempts to restore economic stability were largely unsuccessful. The economic crisis, which had been one of the key causes of the revolution in the first place, persisted, leading to widespread dissatisfaction. Externally, France was still embroiled in war with much of Europe. The Revolutionary Wars had been a defining feature of the revolution from the outset, as neighboring monarchies feared the spread of revolutionary ideals to their own countries. The wars were costly and devastating, but they had also given rise to a new kind of military leader. One of the most significant figures to emerge from the chaos of the Revolutionary Wars was Napoleon Bonaparte, a young general who had won a series of brilliant victories for France. Napoleon's rise was a reflection of the ongoing instability in France. While the Directory struggled to maintain power, a new, charismatic leader was gaining popularity among the military and the people. Napoleon's success on the battlefield earned him the loyalty of the French army, which, in turn, gave him the leverage to challenge the Directory's authority. In 1799, Napoleon staged a coup d'état, overthrowing the government and establishing himself as the ruler of France. This event marked the end of the French Revolution as it had been originally conceived. The revolution's ideals, which had sought to create a republic based on the will of the people, had been replaced by a new regime under the control of one man. The rise of Napoleon represented the failure of the revolution to create a stable and just society. Instead of the hoped-for republic, the revolution had culminated in the emergence of a new form of authoritarian rule. Napoleon's rise to power was not an accident. It was the result of a long period of political instability and disillusionment with the government. The Directory had failed to live up to its promises, and the people of France, exhausted by years of war and economic hardship, were looking for strong leadership. Napoleon offered that leadership, and his charisma and military prowess made him a popular figure. His coup was widely supported by both the military and the people, who were tired of the constant instability. In 1804, Napoleon declared himself Emperor of the French, formally ending the revolution's experiment with republicanism and establishing a new autocratic regime. While Napoleon's rise to power marked the end of the revolution in its original form, it also brought about significant changes. Under Napoleon, France became a dominant force in Europe, and many of the revolutionary ideals that had been espoused during the early years of the revolution were codified into law. The Napoleonic Code, a set of legal reforms that Napoleon instituted, became one of the most important legacies of the revolution. The code established the principles of legal equality, property rights, and individual freedoms, and it influenced legal systems around the world. Napoleon also embarked on a series of military campaigns that expanded France's territory and influence across Europe. His conquests brought many of the ideals of the revolution to other countries, as he abolished feudal systems, spread legal equality, and promoted nationalism. However, Napoleon's authoritarian rule and constant warfare led to immense suffering and loss of life, both in France and in the territories he conquered. His reign, while marked by military success, was also characterized by growing opposition from other European powers, who eventually united to defeat him. In 1814, after a series of defeats in battle, Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba. However, his legacy lived on. The French Revolution, despite its chaotic and violent course, had changed the face of Europe. It had sparked the spread of revolutionary ideas and inspired other uprisings around the world. Napoleon's empire may have fallen, but the social, political, and ideological shifts set in motion by the revolution could not be undone. The ideals of the revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, continued to influence the course of history, shaping the development of modern democratic movements. The French Revolution, though it did not result in the type of stable republic that many had hoped for, had nevertheless achieved several key outcomes. The absolute power of the monarchy had been dismantled, feudal privileges had been abolished, and the foundation for modern democratic governance had been laid. The revolution had reshaped the political landscape of France and Europe, introducing the concepts of popular sovereignty and individual rights, even as it struggled with internal contradictions and the rise of authoritarianism. Napoleon's reign, while ultimately short-lived, was a testament to the revolutionary changes that had taken place in France and the lasting impact of the revolution on the world. The legacy of the French Revolution is complex and multifaceted. It was a revolution that sought to establish a more just and equal society, but was marred by violence, political instability, and the rise of new forms of authoritarianism. Yet, the revolution also laid the groundwork for many of the democratic ideals that continue to shape the modern world. The French Revolution was not a simple triumph or failure. It was a transformative period in history that left an indelible mark on the course of human events. Its ideals and its lessons continue to resonate today, reminding us of the complexities and contradictions of political change and the ongoing struggle for liberty and justice.